What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on Homebrewed Christianity, you're going to get to hear a live conversation. Well, it was recorded live with Brian and Beau, co-authors of Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. This conversation was fun because we were joined by around 400 or so of you podcast listeners who not just joined live, but actually took the time to watch two different lectures they prepared on the history of Christian nationalism and the role mainline Protestants have played in its history. And y'all sent in questions, which helped shape this conversation. It's a new little format, an exploration of sorts that we're trying here at Homebrewed Christianity. And I hope you dig it. I hope you enjoy it. And if you like it, if you want more of this, then consider joining our upcoming online class with Diana Butler-Bass, Tim from the New Evangelicals, and we're going to have 6 other scholars bringing lectures just like Beau and Brian did, and then unpacking it, conversing, interacting in live streams. You can always get the recordings in video and audio, along with a class Facebook group where you can interact. People are using it solo, in groups, with discussion groups at church and things. So yeah, come check it out, faithandpolitics.net, faithandpolitics.net. Also, there's over 70,000 of you that are on the Homebrewed newsletter. We're launching here in June the Process This newsletter. That's right. The Homebrewed Christianity newsletter for years is obviously it's kept growing and stuff like that, but we use it to let people know about classes that are coming, events, info about theology beer camp, all that kind of stuff. And we use it like a normal newsletter, sharing content, extra features, stuff like that, kind of provoking conversation or generating questions to bring back. Well, that more interactive, more content-focused side, we're going to be doing on Substack, the Process This Substack. Get it? Both like processing this, the content and conversations and everything on the podcast, and process thinking, which, I'm a fan of. Anyway, so be on the lookout, because the first series will be a series on artificial intelligence. That's right. It's going to be exciting. Kester Bruin, who you heard on the podcast not too long ago, talking about his book, Godlike, which is looking at history, AI, and all that good stuff. He'll be joining me on the series. We're going to do an intro to AI and what kind of questions come up and such. And then there'll be a series with experts. Some are more like philosophers, or some are computer scientists. So you'll get to see the way both what AI is, how it's developed, what are the ethical questions, how's it changing religion, spirituality, and such. And then at the end of the series, Process This, Artificial Intelligence and the Human Future, we'll do a special concluding style live podcast. The goal with the newsletter is both to increase interaction. Like currently there's so many different social media sites and places people leave comments and interact and stuff. So trying to narrow it to one of them where the community can build and people can interact. Also, because doing these different series, we hope to frame them with intros and conclusions, and so that the interviews in the middle and such kind of help the community wrestle and see it from different perspectives and what different disciplines contribute. And then boom shakalaka, it's all woven together, and we're able to have a thicker conversation together. So that's what we're trying out. That's what we're exploring as we launch the Process This newsletter. It's going to be exciting. And you'll know that we're also launching theologyclass.com, which is only taken like 2 years to build. But you'll hear more about that later. All right. Anyway, thank you to Beau and Brian for joining this live stream, doing the lectures, and interacting. Looking forward to more things like this and getting to hang out with them again too. All righty. Peace out, my friends. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today we're getting to hang out live with Beau and Brian, authors of Baptizing America. And for those of you who have already viewed their lectures, looking at this and sent in questions, hopefully I do a good job weaving them in, because I also had a stack of things I wanted to talk about after reading the book. But if you're joining live and you have other questions or things come up, feel free to put it in the chat. Just put the word question in front of it so I know it's a question. because sometimes people in chat just talk to each other. Sometimes they're at work and pretending they aren't listening to something on YouTube with their phone in their pocket. In that case, they don't chat. So we'll see. But thank you, Beau and Brian, for being here. And I'm excited to see where this goes.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to this.
So you both are connected at Word and Way, and so maybe one of you can just give us an idea of what Word and Way's up to help us know, like, what were the passions and work and things that you do that brought your friendship and stuff together to generate the project.
Sure. Word and Way has been around actually since 1896. It started as an independent Baptist publication covering both Southern and Northern, now American Baptist, across the Midwest region. And we've gone through some different iterations in life in those times, and we've become much more ecumenical in the last couple of decades. And so we're continuing to do the work. We still have a print publication after almost 128 years, but most of our work now is online with podcasts like Dangerous Dogma, and we have a Substack newsletter, A Public Witness, where we both write at the intersection of faith and politics.
Awesome.
And our origin story goes back a little farther. We actually had connected on social media when I was out in D.C. Working at Sojourners, and Brian was a professor out on the East Coast, but had never met in person. And then I got called to a church in the state capital, Missouri, which is where Brian was living and Word and Way was located. And so our online connection became an offline connection. We started doing regular lunches and trying to solve all the world's problems over salad and soup. And ended up deciding to do some writing together. And that collaboration kind of led to a conversation about Christian nationalism. Everybody was talking about this topic. We just kept saying, all of this stuff has mainline Protestant roots. Like, all of this does. And nobody's saying that. So after about 6 months of really lamenting that this was a missing piece of the conversation, we wrote an essay for Religion and Politics that ran in January of 23, kind of naming that, wondering if the theologians, the sociologists, the historians were going to kind of shoot holes in our theory. Instead, we got a lot of affirmation to that. And so that's when we decided to turn this into a book. So it was really because of Twitter that we first got connected, and living in this center of Missouri brought us together as writing partners that led to this book.
Awesome. So, Brian, one of the regular questions that comes in anytime something like this comes up is just how contested the label Christian nationalism is. And it even comes up right after people share new data and are trying to explain data and such. So I wonder, as someone who both is engaging in the larger research and stuff in the present and addressing kind of religion and politics in the public square and trying to wrestle with the larger sociological data, the history of the church, what do you find helpful when trying to give a grasp of what Christian nationalism is? Because it seems some definitions are really narrow, some are extremely broad. And I know, having received, 50 or so emails about our conversation, a good number of them are just like, well, if mainline Protestants are Christian nationalists, then basically anyone that knows, doesn't put an extra word between Jesus and Christ is.
Yeah, it's great to start with definitions, and we provide some definitions, as relying heavily on sociologists like Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead. They give very technical definitions, based on the research. Groups like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, Amanda Tyler. But I think a lot of it can come down very simply to this idea of an ideology that fuses and even confuses what it means to be an American and what it means to be a Christian, to the point that to be a good American is to be a good Christian, and sometimes even vice versa. And so it's these merging of these two different spheres and these two different ideologies. As for the question of if mainline Protestants are Christian nationalists, and we all are, in some sense, if you grew up in a white Christian church in the United States, Christian nationalism was just in the air that we breathe. And so it's there for all of us. And I think, Beau and I are still detoxing from our own Christian nationalism in our past. And I think that's what's really helpful about the work of Whitehead and Perry, is that Christian nationalism is a continuum. So it's not that you're either a Christian nationalist or you're not. They ask all these questions, they put you on a scale. And so I think for particularly white Christians in the U.S., we all have a little bit of Christian nationalism in us. And we're working on how to separate what's American and what's gospel.
Mm-hmm.
if I could just add that term trip may be something that's, come more into our common language in recent years. But again, this phenomenon is not new. I mean, Gorski traces it all the way back to the Puritans. And what Brian's often fond of saying, and has drilled into me, which is if what we're mad about, Trumpian Christians or evangelicals doing today, and we're going to label that Christian nationalism in 2024. Well, if the mainline Protestants did it 20 years ago, it also has to be Christian nationalism then. It's really a demand for some consistency and not just blaming people we dislike or disagree with. We have to hold ourselves accountable and interrogate our own practices as well.
I don't know. The way I see a public square, consistency is not important as long as you get to lambast people that don't agree with you. I don't know. It's somewhere in the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Do you think that before we got started, Brian, you mentioned that this is the 4th anniversary coming up of Trump doing the Bible bit in the middle of after he clears out the churchyard and such. And both in the book and in the lectures, you use as an example of just the way maybe our kind of the way the public square is prejudiced to find a problem in white Christian nationalism among evangelicals, that we might miss the mainline Protestant roots. So take us back to 4 years ago, and the way the history that you're presenting in the book helps reframe that moment.
Yeah. So Saturday is the 4th anniversary of that infamous Bible moment where Trump awkwardly held up the Bible. It wasn't quite upside down. It's often said that, but it was weird. He held it up very awkwardly. And it was cast at this moment of, Trump was reaching out to his evangelical base. They had literally tear gassed the Lafayette Square, and the protesters been there, including a couple of clergy who had been on church property were tear gassed and, driven away. And so then he goes over there for a photo op. He doesn't give remarks. Some of his advisors had said, hey, go read some scripture or say a prayer, or, but he just held up the Bible. And a reporter asked him, is that your Bible? And he says, this is so hilarious. He says, it's a Bible. I mean, come on. I mean, he's like a softball coach. It later learned that it was Ivanka's Bible that she had carried over in her, like $1,500 purse or something. So
all of 2 Corinthians was highlighted, though. That's
right. Yeah. And so he holds it up and everything. But again, it was cast this moment of like, see, this is him reaching out to evangelicals. But if you stop and take a look at the viral images from that day, and, I don't even, have to, show it to you because we all remember him holding the Bible there, right? Everything and everyone that you see in that photo is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. Mainline Protestants don't like it when we acknowledge this, but Donald Trump is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. He was confirmed in a Presbyterian church. He was married in Reform and Episcopal churches. He identified as a Presbyterian when he went to the White House and at the moment that he's holding up the Bible. So at that point, he was a lifelong mainline Protestant. Then the church he's standing in front of is St. John's Episcopal Church, which is not only a mainline tradition church, but is also proud of its status as the, quote, Church of the Presidents. Right? They have a sign outside bragging that every president of the United States since James Madison has attended services here. I will note, though, I'm not sure Joe Biden has gone as president, though if you go to their website, they have a picture of Biden in the church when he was vice president. So I think they're, kind of maybe working the definition there of every president has attended there since James Madison.
Mainline Protestants can be generous with their hermeneutic,
Yeah. So, right. So this is a church that has been proud of its status there across the street from the White House and its connections to power. And then the Bible that he's holding up. Even the Bible is a product of the mainline Protestant denomination because Trump said it was a Bible. We actually know from some of the photos that it was a revised standard version of the Bible. So this is the product of the National Council of Churches, came out in 1952 with an ecumenical group that at the time was formed and led largely by the mainline Protestant leaders. It was a translation that had been led by a mainline minister. And so everything in that moment, from the person, the president, the church, and the Bible are products of the mainline Protestant tradition, which just goes to show the argument that we make in the book. We are living in the religious and political timeline that mainline Protestants created.
Well, and Brian's actually underselling this because not only is all of that true, but inside St. John's Church, there is a pew that is reserved for the presidents. And that pew is reserved because John Tyler, a former president, left an endowment to maintain that pew for the president. So the presidents literally own a pew. Own maybe too strong of a term. They have control of a pew in the church because of a financial gift. So you can imagine, I'm going to empathize with Donald Trump for a minute. I've never done this before. But he's standing there in the White House. He's looking over Lafayette Square. He sees this church, and you can imagine why he thinks that would be a prop for him. He knows that there's a pew in that church that's reserved for him anytime he wants to walk in. He sees it as his prop.
Yeah. Oh man, I can never tell. It's certain mainline Protestant churches I've worked out with the right constituency that you endow things. I didn't know which was worse, like an endowment for an organ that only someone from Germany can fix, or endowed American flag, because that's what you need. You know, but when you got an endowed seat at the church, considering just the connection for Trump between religious support and money, it's not surprising that he could have got a little confused there.
Yeah.
In the chat, someone actually just asked if Trump had ever gone to St. John's, apart, I guess from his photo.
Yes.
Moment.
Yeah, I saw that question as well, and I wanted to emphasize that because it's actually a really important moment. So a lot of presidents hold a service at St. John's around their inaugural. And so Trump did that. They opened up the church for Trump to hold a service. But this wasn't a moment where they, prophetically preached to power, right? No, they turn over the entire service to the incoming president. So the Trump people got to pick who preached. And so Robert Jeffress.
Oh.
Robert Jeffress is the person that goes to the pulpit at St. John's Episcopal Church to preach to Donald Trump on the day of his inauguration. And so they literally turned over their holy space to a Southern Baptist megachurch pastor who had been one of the first kind of, Trumpian supporters on the evangelical right, to the point that he had declared, I think it was on NPR during the 2016 campaign, that he didn't want some meek and mild turn the other cheek person. He wanted the toughest SOB he could find. So he was saying he would vote for Donald Trump over Jesus Christ. And this is who they turned the pulpit and the sermon over to. And that's part of what we are pointing out is the danger then of embracing Christian nationalism, is that we lose that prophetic voice and become essentially chaplains to the empire here, and become part of the problem.
Yeah. Do you think, now I know Word and Way has a Baptist background, and as a Baptist, the separation of church and state, despite what our voices end up in the public square, is historically one of the traditions that is aggressive about it. James Dunn, who used to be head of the Baptist Joint Committee and was my ethics professor in divinity school, would just go off on rants anytime something came up that he was uncomfortable with. And one of the things you could get him to say without much effort is, well, every time the church and the state get in bed, they both go home with a disease. And I think that underneath part of what helps kind of extend the conversation around Christian nationalism to the place of different religious groups in America in the public square is that kind of concern that church and state relations raises about power. Like, what is the role and function that religious faith for the individual, but also public witness as a community, like what does that look like expressed in a multi-religious, pluralistic democracy? And I wonder for both of you, where so much of your background's been focused on church and state relations, if that helps you kind of come at this question in a different way.
Yeah, so I think, Tripp, you're right to name that a lot of what we're seeing with the more intense expressions of Christian nationalism now are the idea that, Christians are losing power, or a certain type of Christianity is losing power in the public square. And there's this sort of rearguard action to prop it up through these sort of anti-democratic ways. And this ideology is sort of driving that. So I think that's a lot of what's going on here. I will say I've become more of a church-state separationist. Brian sort of converted me a little bit here because
Well
I
done,
do
Brian.
think, and I do think that a lot of the myth out there is that church-state separation is really about secularism, and it's not. It's really about protecting the church's witness and making sure that the church can be the kind of gospel-preaching, Christ-centered community that it's supposed to be in whether it's in empire and wherever it's located. That we need to make sure that the church isn't compromised by the state. And what we've seen too many times of late is how compromised the church really is. And I kind of think that's what makes mainline Protestants uncomfortable with this idea that they're part of the problem, is that it means that we've been compromised too. But I think we tell enough stories in the book to show that that's happened. So to give you one example, right, we talk about Donald Trump got a lot of pushback for hawking the God and Country Bible recently. And that was egregious and gross, and I didn't buy one. But, if somebody buys one for Christmas, it wouldn't surprise me because I got family members that will think that's what the pastor needs. However, this happened before. In 1952, Harry Truman received the very first copy of that revised standard version of the Bible that Donald Trump held up in Lafayette Square by leaders from the National Council of Churches in the Oval Office at the White House. They went outside of the Rose Garden, and Harry Truman held that Bible up and said, "I'm so glad this Bible exists in the world. If only we could sneak it into underneath the Iron Curtain, we could, all of our foreign policy goals could be established," or something to that effect. It was, that's a paraphrase. But the point was he tied this new Bible to his own foreign policy agenda. There's a lot wrong with what's going on there. And there's something pretty strange about these religious leaders from the National Council of Churches seeking out the president to make their Bible look more legitimate. It's a very uncomfortable place to be that I think represents that kind of compromise that we're so angry at American evangelicals for perpetuating today.
Mm-hmm.
And Trip, I appreciate your comment and question there, because as one of those Baptists that does still believe in church-state separation, right? We've gotten a bad reputation in more recent years because the dominant Baptist group no longer believes in true religious liberty and church-state separation. But we used to, right? Rather, Randall Balmer asked, where have all the Baptists gone, right? We used to believe in church-state separation and largely, don't anymore. And I think that's really important because what we see from where the Baptist idea of church-state separation came from is we see a danger of Christian nationalism. And so in the colonial period, the early Baptists were persecuted. They were thrown in prison for preaching, for their churches, and they weren't thrown in the prison by the secularists. They were thrown into prison by the Christians. I guess they were Christian colonies, not, Christian nationalists at that moment, but, in Virginia and Massachusetts and so forth, they're being persecuted. And that shows something really important about Christian nationalism. Because what it says is that if we have a Christian nationalist state, it doesn't mean all the Christians get to run things. Right? It only means a select, narrow slice of Christianity gets to run things. And Baptists experienced the downside as Christians in a Christian state a couple hundred years ago. And frankly, it's happening right now in Russia as well. I mean, Russia is a Christian nationalist state. The Russian Orthodox Church and Putin's regime they're in bed and they both got the disease. I mean, right? I mean, and they're persecuting a lot of religious minorities. Jehovah's Witnesses are the most persecuted group in Russia. But number 2 is Baptist. Number 3 are Pentecostals, right? And so even in a Christian nationalist state, Christians are being persecuted because they're not the, quote, right type of Christian. And that's the danger of Christian nationalism. It really is a danger to all of us.
Yeah. And, one of the things that that I can kind of continue to think about, especially in the last year and a half, having come back to the States and in the South for the first time in like a long time, is the way those who find that, the Jeffress image of like, we don't need no nice guy. Why would you want someone that you describe that using language of Jesus? We want someone's going to kick ass and take names for the Lord. I wonder how much of it is the formation of that kind of desire for church-state separation in the early colonies was one that made space for a pluralism of Protestantism, largely. And with Roger Williams, the Baptist who, Providence, Rhode Island, and such. There, he's wanting to have a pure church, like a church where you're not coercing anyone, so that the community of believers are actual people committed to the way of Jesus, so they live it out. And that's what's compelling in the public square, is a faithful community. I don't know, maybe they pray for their enemies and turn the other cheek and not, pull a Trump. But to me, part of what's going on is when you have those traditions and the pluralism gets more and more deep, and the cultural levers, especially for those that aren't in, big cities that come out of universities, then it's easy to see the public square, popular media and culture as expressing such a different sense of shared values than you have. That desire for a religious market space is now being undermined by the public square, where the potential to hand your faith off to your kids is being undermined by, well, I'm sure like TikTok, or, they'll go through their rantings and raving about different things, but underneath it, the connection of a growing pluralism and the decentering of culture to a multiplicity of cultures that are algorithmically mediated, and you get targeted and all these kinds of things, makes the cultural inertia of Christendom or civil religion and these kind of things dissipate. So then when you go, how do we hand on our faith, or what does it look like in the public square? There's just so little of shared affirmations. And if you grew up and valued the Christianish civil religion, or when the sociology of what happens on Sundays valued Christian religious practice, and the school calendar made space for it, and all that kind of stuff, those impacts and those changes will be felt as a deep threat. And so I wonder how, as people connected to religious communities, how you understand that feeling and things without maybe going, yeah, well, the correct answer is, to use a minority of the population to then coerce the majority into your desires.
Yeah, so I have the privilege of pastoring a local church and a community that I love, and I'm fond of reminding them the only people that are going to teach us what it means to be Christian are ourselves, right? So for too long, mainline Protestants thought we have control of the culture, so we can outsource some of this training in what it means to be a moral person or even a Christian to the public schools or some other institution in our society. And we're in this increasingly pluralistic world, we're coming to recognize that, if we're going to know what we believe, we're going to have to teach it in our own spaces and places. And ironically, that puts us a lot closer to the early Christians, right? They were there in the Roman Empire. They were huddled in houses. They were learning what it meant to follow this resurrected Jesus. After that first Easter, they were doing what we should be doing now, right? Which is really having a strong sense of their own identity and living in a world as faithfully as they knew how to be without trying to take the world over. And the problem with Christian nationalism is it cares more about political power than it does about authentic faith. So I think in some sense, this moment of pluralism is actually really helpful in allowing the church to see what we care about the most. And in some sense, the battles we're choosing to fight are quite revealing about what we actually care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think what you're getting at, Trip, is really important because, we're Christians, we want to see more people become Christians. And so I get then the temptation of saying, things aren't going the way they should be. You know what? Society would be better if more people were Christians. Our world would be better if more people followed Christ. So why don't we just institute this, right? Why don't we just codify it? Why don't we just, keep society into, falling into disrepair and, immorality and so on and so on. I get that the temptation there to preserve and to make the world better. But what we've seen from history is that it never actually works. Any time that we've tried to codify, it doesn't work. And I think because it undermines a basic understanding of faith, right? That people have to have the freedom to choose. And if they do, if you don't have the right to say no to a faith, you don't really have the right to say yes either. And so it's always destroyed the integrity of the faith. I mean, I'm thinking about this, we're sitting on the 90th anniversary right now of the Barmen Declaration. It came out 90 years ago tomorrow, after a 3-day gathering in 1934, and a prophetic statement coming primarily from Karl Barth, but on the early aspect of, Adolf Hitler's been in power for 15, 16 months. Most of the horrors of the Nazi regime that we know of are still in the future at the point that they write this declaration. And they're getting to some core Christian nationalism stuff, right? We would call it Christian nationalism today, is what they're preaching against, and warning both about the danger of the state taking over the church and the role of the church, but then also warning about the church taking over that which belongs to the state and essentially becoming the state. Both of these are heretical. They reject these doctrines, right? And so I think that's a really important reminder throughout history that anytime we've tried to codify Christianity, it's never gone well for the faith.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I thought you were about to say something, Beau.
Well, I was just saying if I want to continue this conversation, so I'll just amen to what Brian said and just say, again, from where I sit as a local church pastor, one of the biggest obstacles to people walking through the doors of the church today is them seeing these expressions of Christian nationalism and some of the other ways that quote unquote Christianity is showing up in our politics, and saying, if that's what it means to be Christian, I don't want to be a part of that. Right. So so in some sense, Christian nationalism is really hurting the church in ways that I think a lot of its purveyors don't see because they're getting what they want. But the rest of us are really struggling with all these cultural stereotypes and the negative associations that's now around the word Christian in our society because of what these Christian nationalists are doing. It's a huge obstacle to the gospel in a very practical way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually think you're right in my experience and as a clergy at Mainline Protestant congregations that parents and communities have not come to grips with the way the culture dominance of Christianity's changed what it looks like to hand the faith on. Now, imagine we could come up with reasons it was problematic in the past, that if the dominant culture of the most powerful military in the world is the inertia that passes the faith on, it might be problematic. But in the congregation, I was surprised that what got the most turnout for parents was like workshops on how to pray with your kid. Things where these are members, they tithe and go regularly. They are volunteering in leadership, and then a little survey, and you realize they have no idea how to pray with their kids. And half the Sunday school teachers didn't either, and you had to kind of coach them on that. But they were there because of the values and these kinds of things. But what it looked like intrinsically in their life and in their community, what it's like to take the lead, is something that has been, so much of it been outsourced to the school and the state and to culture and to Peanuts cartoons and things like that. That there really is a kind of discipleship deficiency in mainline Protestantism that I think, seeing the history of the way they were part of shaping that Christian century, the rise of what came to be Christian nationalism, kind of helps us think, well, maybe we probably shouldn't keep the same formation practices that cultivated alongside, right, the problem we're dealing with now. Even the way Beau said it, like teach our kids the faith. A lot of people don't know the faith, and then mainline Protestants are the ones that are obsessed with teaching, right? Like, we're most likely going to stick kids in education time until they get through confirmation, and then they can learn to worship. Even though, psychologists would say it goes the other way around. Like, if you wanted to pass on the faith, they would be actively embodied in the practices and in the liturgy or the worship experiences, in service and things. And the understanding of ideas comes later. Because those are the more of the just so stories that explain the animating religious engagement. But like, even though we value education, you can just look at the face of church leaders when I'm like, well, if we were paying attention to psychology, we would not make them get to 16 years old till they worshiped. And in fact, if stones and trees can do it in the Psalms, I imagine your 4-year-old can. It's one of the things I loved about this book is that it tells a history to something almost every mainliner goes, oh, and then it raises a question as, then what would the form of faith look like if we're going to hand on a faith that's vibrant and compelling, and one that doesn't see the public square and the religious diversity of our neighbors is something to exploit or reject, but something to celebrate. from our own center. That's not even a question. It was just,
and I'm just here going, I love it.
It's on a post-it I wrote in your book. But one way I think of putting the question, and this was something, we had two different questions about. Let me find the most fun way of putting it. All right. Pete said, what's their deal with civil religion? I wish we had more of it. Then maybe Twitter would sound better. But the question of civil religion, so I'd love for you to take some time to kind of unpack it and help us understand what was problematic about it and what kind of openings maybe are there for families, individuals, and communities if we take the criticism seriously.
Yeah, so the basic idea of civil religion that Robert Bellah is the sociologist who first popularized this idea. It was this idea that the nation needs religious unifying symbols and language to bring us together. And so civil religion has often been treated by scholars since then as kind of the innocent, under God and in the pledge and in God we trust. And it God bless America at the end of presidential speeches, right? It just kind of brings us together. It's a unifying, there's no harm. It's not exclusionary, as opposed to Christian nationalism, and that's bad and dangerous. So we make the argument that I don't think that clear distinction can be made, and basically for a couple of reasons. So first of all, when Bellah publishes his essay in 1967, 92% of Americans identify as Christian. And you only have a couple of percent that identify as atheist. And so, sure, if we use under God language, it's pretty unifying. It actually brings the country together. That doesn't work today. Today, it's only about 2/3 of Americans identify as Christian. So you have a third of Americans with the rise of the nuns, particularly, and N-O-N-E-S, right? Nuns that you've talked about before. The rise of the nuns. I mean, this is a fact that now civil religion today looks like Christian nationalism because it's not unifying in a pluralistic society. So even if the civil religious idea or construct worked, it's expired. It just doesn't work. But we would also argue that civil religion was never so innocent, even back then, that sure, maybe only a couple percent of Americans, felt this, not included in the under God language, but that was still a problem. It was still a problem that we were telling people that because of the religious faith, they were not fully American. That because of their religious faith or no faith at all, that they could not truly pledge allegiance to their nation, that they could not be fully patriotic. And it's not just that we're saying this. I mean, as you know, in the book, we go back to the original documents of how this stuff happened. And I think the most significant moment, honestly, for me is under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. One, because we know exactly how it got into the pledge. And two, because the minister who gets it there says the quiet part out loud. And I think this really gets to the heart of the problem with civil religion, because Robert Bellah calls under God in the pledge as part of civil religion. Right? And so there's a moment in 1954, we're actually coming up on, I guess, the 70th anniversary here in a couple of weeks of under God going into the Pledge of Allegiance. So when the pledge was first written, the common authorship is to a Baptist minister, a Baptist socialist minister. And those two terms we don't always put together, though I've been called both a Baptist and a Marxist. So I guess that's pretty close from Roger Stone there. But he was a true socialist. Like he was actually like working for the Christian socialist organizations and writing. And Robert Bellamy. And so he leaves God out of the pledge, and it sits that way for decades. And then we get this moment where Dwight D. Eisenhower is about to attend a Presbyterian church in DC. And the pastor knows that Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to come because it's Lincoln Sunday. And so since Lincoln had been a part of that church, presidents would often come on the Sunday closest to Lincoln's birthday. And so he writes his sermon for an audience of one to make the argument of why under God should be in the pledge. And he makes the argument in the sermon based on Christian nationalism, a history that we were based as a Christian nation. We should be based on the 10 Commandments and Jesus' teaching as a nation. But then he also says the quiet part out loud, that he said that an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms and calls atheists spiritual parasites on the nation. Now, the sermon is amazingly impactful. Right? He preaches this in February, and the Pledge of Allegiance is changed by June. Members of Congress vote for it. President signs it, right? I mean, Beau and I are just excited when our sermons remember the next Sunday. This sermon's
Well, if only his critique of capital had been that effective.
right?
Inspired legislation.
And by the way, this is a progressive mainline Protestant pastor. He marches later of MLK. He is opposed to the Vietnam War, but he also wants us to be a Christian nation. It kind of messes up some of our circles we have today when we think about some of this ideology as a Presbyterian Church USA minister. And so, but as he's saying from the beginning, under God and the pledge is a way of marking this, that we are a Christian nation, and as you are an atheist, you're not really fully American. And so we don't think civil religion really works, that it really is just maybe it's a friendlier, cuter, cuddlier version of Christian nationalism. Maybe it's just the gateway drug to Christian nationalism, but ultimately it's Christian nationalism, particularly in today's pluralistic society.
And I'm going to throw a little shade here. I also think that a lot of the people, not all certainly, but a lot of the people that defend civil religion haven't read Bella's piece or haven't read it in a very long time, because I went back, I hadn't read it since grad school. I went back to read it for the book. I read it 3 different times, and I still struggle to understand exactly what Bella's talking about in that piece. I mean, it is a very vague concept he's trying to flesh out, but we point this out in the book. He also gives a couple of warnings of what the dangers of this is, that it could bleed into nationalism. He talks about some of the assumptions that are necessary for it, including sort of a shared sense of values that in our, as Brian pointed out, more and more pluralistic society don't exist. So I think Bella today, if you were rewriting that piece, might perhaps have a different understanding of civil religion, that in some sense it's a period piece that no longer holds. And like you said, I don't know where you can draw that line. What is civil religion and what is Christian nationalism? I don't think the term is robust enough and well-defined enough for us to truly know where one goes into the other. If somebody wants to try to separate this is this and this is that, fine. But I think more, as Brian said, more often what happens is somebody thinks they're doing something harmless and it ends up really lending support to the sort of Christian nationalism ideology.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways you kind of see it show up as the more treasured category, maybe to an animated, more particular faith, is the growing expansion of, Christian nation, Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic tradition, and you get in Obama like the adding on to the more humanist tradition, and underneath that though is a desire for something that is, it seems culturally more problematic in America than a lot of other places in the West, namely like stating some shared framework of cultural shared framework of value and meaning, a reservoir from which you at least begin a debate in a democracy with some kind of shared consensus that gets expressed and wrestled with, but we have some things we hold together. And I think part of what we saw in that kind of growing on of from adding in Catholics with JFK, and then adding in Jewish people and Muslims, and then expanding the tent is some way of saying there's a deep shared set of values that as a nation we want our best selves to live into. And when historically they come out of competing Protestantisms in early America, it gets difficult to figure out how you would articulate them without resorting to something like, kind of like the kind of things you can compute, measure, and clarify, which is, I think, the tendency in more neoliberals type of things. The kind of things you can put on graphs and think about economically. Like, it's just really hard for humans to be animated without a shared story, and then managed by the managerial class in politics. The church does this too, and in the state and such. When the shared story that moves you together isn't there, and so to me, part of the empathy I've developed for those that find Christian nationalism or civil religion attractive is they are recognizing the big challenge of a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, including non-religious democracy as diverse, huge as ours. That human beings want to have a shared story, And this kind of critical reflection is helpful, but I wonder what it looks like to have and own your particular form of faith and cultivate a public square that doesn't increasingly come up with a larger net to then call it all same. Does that make sense? Like that to me is a fascinating question, and something Jeffrey Stout brings it up a lot. Then that's something I love in his work, but I have a hard time understanding it, let alone putting it on a bumper sticker.
Yeah, no, and I think your reference to Stout is spot on there. I'm going to do something dangerous, Trip. I'm going to push back on you on your own show here because you control who's here. But I'll say this, right? So I think that everything you said is just true about we do need some kind of common story and that even is located in some sort of sense of the transcendent, sort of culturally transcendent, shared values, commitment to egalitarianism, liberty, things like that. I think the danger is just trying to root that into particular. And I think the danger is not just for the country of excluding certain people who don't affirm that particular tradition, who aren't Christian. But it's also the danger the other way, right? Which is when we talk about under God and the pledge, what God are we talking about, right? Is it the mainline God, the evangelical God, the Catholic God, the Protestant God, the Jewish God, once we try to start giving those words any kind of meaning, we very quickly start to become very sectarian. And so in some sense, part of what makes civil religion work is as long as you don't really talk about it too much or try to put too much meat on the bone, we can all say the same words, mean different things, and we can all pretend like we're doing something together, but we're actually doing a bunch of separate things at the same time. So I really wonder, does it actually hold given what people actually mean by the language that they're using? I do think to sort of weigh into the debate with Stout, you go to Rawls. I mean, this idea of a public reason, right? I can be a religious person. I can have beliefs and values. I can bring those into the public square, but I have to also present them with arguments that other people can understand and accept that aren't rooted in my particular religious tradition. So I think there is very much a way for religious people to be involved in the public square. We're not calling for a secularizing of the public square. We're calling for mainline Protestants to take back their own tradition and teach it well in their churches and to enter into the public square on an equal level with everybody else. And the problem that Christian nationalism has is it doesn't want to see everybody else as equal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do think, we need shared values, right? But I think we can have them without it being faith-based values, that we don't have to be a Christian nation to have a shared sense of values as a community. Right? I think the values of democracy can be something that can bring us together. And by the way, we're seeing clearly that that's not actually a shared value across our society, right? Some people would rather have a, quote, Christian nation or Christian state than to have a democracy where all people are equal. And I can make an argument to Christians as to why we should support democracy, and I can do it from a faith-based perspective. And I can also enter the public square and make an argument for democracy that non-Christians, those of another faith tradition or no faith at all, can also see. I'm not saying, hey, we should be a democracy because of Christianity. I'm saying we should be a democracy because it's the better system for us all, that all people are treated equal, that all people have a right and a voice, that we have values like the separation of church and state. That's a value that could bring us together and unify us. And we see a pushback on that. And let's be honest, a big part of this is racism, right? It's a big part of what's happening in Christian nationalism. The sociologist data shows us that Christian nationalism is tied to racist opinions. And we've really only been a democracy since 1965. This is still an actually really new experiment because we're not a democracy until everyone actually gets a chance to vote. So we're really new, and we're seeing a pushback to this more pluralistic, democratic, small d democratic society where all people have a voice, and some people want to push back on that. And so that's the challenge today. Are we going to be a nation that's united around a particular religious tradition? Or could we have some other value that we come around? And we happen to think democracy is a value that we should all rally behind and protect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some of these questions just got a lot more difficult for me after getting a faculty member left, and all of a sudden I got assigned to teaching the social psych and religion class. And I realized that our biological and psychological inheritance was not made for a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy, and such. Though I will say one of the unique things when it goes to the particular, if we do discipleship well, the particular is actually the face of the other and not your own cherished self-identity. So when the face of the other is the particular for your orientation, then you don't bear false witness against your neighbor, and you pray for your enemy and those kinds of things, which can generate a different kind of frame, which I think you can see like as expressed as a Baptist, like in someone like Roger Williams, or think of the way Rauschenbusch, when he moves into the city, realizes the way the violence of the economic system is impacting his parishioners and these kind of things. Do you think one of the problems that is taking place the younger you are is suggesting that democracy is a shared value is problematized because of the two-party system, and the volume of questions that I got, 3/4 of them have addendums on them that either go, why the hell would I vote for either one of these two guys? And they're not people that were naturally going to vote for Trump. And they list off a number of things. What's the point of, is our two-party system even performing democracy in a way we would trust it as a shared value? How can we as Christians want to save democracy by keeping in place a foreign policy that undermines any form of our deepest shared faith commitments? And that, like, little things like the undoing the Democratic Party's nomination process and having genuine debates of whether or not we wanted as a party for Biden to be nominated again. The kind of the kind of undermining of democracy while celebrating it as a solution in the political sphere for an increasing number of people, especially those that are younger, feels the same way as when you hear boomers talk about the wonders of our economic system. And then you're like, yeah, but you were never a gig worker and you didn't have debt for college. Or they're like, why don't you get your kids to go on Wednesday night to do choir so then they can be in choir and they'll sing on service, and then you get them to come all these other 5 times. And you're like, do you know what you're talking about? Like, you don't understand the form of life. And it seems like part of what in so many of these structures that in economic, state, church, there is a similar nostalgia, right, for mainline Protestants' glory days, for the post-World War II economic consensus of growing wealth and growing voices into the democracy, for all these kinds of things that the moment we problematize particular religious traditions, I think we end up problematizing a lot of other things that make a constructive response. It's like, where do you set your hat and where do you put yourself? And there were so many questions like this. I was just going to try to voice them, and then you can talk amongst yourselves.
I mean, I knew this was going to be a lot of intellectual fun coming on the podcast, but wow, that's a big question. For me, back to what Brian was saying, I do think I can make an argument as a Christian in defense of democracy, which is democracy is the best system for allowing all people to flourish as God intends. And that's a very deep theological commitment for me. Now, your point, Tripp, is right now there's a lot of people that aren't flourishing under democracy. And I don't know that democracy is to blame for that, but certainly democracy hasn't worked itself out well in a way that is promoting the flourishing of everybody nationally or globally. What I do think, if we go back to the civil rights tradition, right, a lot of that moment was calling us to live up to our ideals, right? It wasn't asking us to change our ideals. It was calling us to fully realize them. And I think that project is left unfinished. I think there's a lot more work we have to do in becoming a democracy in the truest sense of the term. And again, we're seeing some democratic backsliding right now. But I think that what we should actually do is work to become a more robust system where everybody is treated equally, everybody does get a say, and unfortunately, the powers that be, politically, economically, militarily, they aren't always wanting to allow that to flourish in the way that it should.
Yeah, I mean, I feel your question, and so I'll just throw myself in the younger camp there. How's that work? So, I mean, we're both millennials, so we'll identify there in the younger camp there with you, Tripp. But I mean, I feel it this year, right? I don't want to vote for Genocide Joe. I mean, right? I'm upset at the foreign policy, and I also recognize the danger of someone with authoritarian impulses who's saying the quiet part out loud and is very clear that it doesn't want to have elections anymore and wants to deport people who are U.S. citizens merely for peacefully protesting a foreign policy decision, right? I mean, there are good choices. That also doesn't mean that there aren't more dangerous choices even embedded in all of that. And also, I think it's important to recognize that democracy is more than voting for the president. And in fact, it's more than just voting, right? And so, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work on, as the people, we the people, and work on making the society better and getting engaged. I mean, I think that's, the protests are important. I've loved the protest voting has been, a way of signaling in the primaries, discontent. And so it's important to recognize that democracy is much more than one particular vote. And in fact, if we get so focused on just the presidential election, then that's how we get into some of the messes that we're in, right? I mean, it's not the White House. That's not the only problem that we have right now or for the next 4 years. We have problems in the Supreme Court. We have a whole lot of problems in Congress. We have problems in the governor's mansions and the state legislatures and in your city council. And we have to show up and get involved. And then the question is, how do we get involved? What are we demanding when we show up? Are we showing up and saying, I want more power and more rights for me and my people? That's what Christian nationalism is doing, right? Or are we saying, I want to make this a better community for everyone? And that's what the civil rights movement was doing. When the Reverend Dr. King was showing up, he wasn't saying, I expect all of you to be Christian. He wasn't saying, I expect you to have more rights for me and just my people. He's saying, let's live into this ideal that we still haven't lived into then or now, that all people are citizens, that all people have equal rights, that all people deserve equality and equity. And it's tough. It's an ongoing process, right? They're creating a more perfect union with a huge emphasis on the more.
Yeah. One of the things that continuously shows up in surveys of Americans and religious practitioners and correlating their political identity is the way in which, mainline Protestants, if you were to just survey their clergy, the second most popular party is going to be the DSA, not the Republicans. But if you look at the congregants, they're on broad very divided politically. And so I wonder how you see this kind of historical opening shaping a way for clergy in different contexts that they may have similar commitments that get expressed in the book and in the lectures unpacking it, but they're in a congregation where the polarization and tribal tension is front of mind because that's who's in their congregations. That you have, a host of different political commitments in a lot of mainline Protestants. So what is kind of what are more practical things or questions that clergy and faith leaders or community leaders can take into wrestling with it when there's not a dominant tribal expression at the congregational level?
Yeah, let me just give a really easy example. Let's take the flag in the sanctuary. So many a pastor has been fired or run into huge conflict over trying to deal with, the question whether the flag should be taken out of the sanctuary. And I think what Brian and I talk about in the book is, there's a reason why that flag got there. And we should know that history and tell that story. We should ask the congregation what that flag is doing in their sanctuary. We should ask them what they're doing in their sanctuary. If they're worshiping the God who is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, why are they bringing any nationalistic symbol into that sacred space? I had a friend, and we mentioned this book, who talks about the sanctuary as an embassy of heaven. And just like when you're in D.C. and you walk onto the Australian embassy's campus, you don't expect to see the American flag. Why would you expect to see the flag of any nation flown in an embassy of heaven? But if we can have that conversation on the terms of our faith, right? And so all of a sudden this conversation becomes about not what is the American flag and are we good patriots, but what is the sanctuary? What are we doing when we're gathered for worship? And then why is this national symbol in here? It becomes, again, about who we are as Christians and who we are as the church, not who we are as Republicans or Democrats, Americans or others. And we really need to change the terrain in which these conversations are happening. We, in some sense, have made our politics our religion. We have given our politics primacy. And the church needs to reclaim what it believes is ultimately ultimate. And that's, I think, the path forward on a lot of this stuff is we've got to put politics in its place. Very important. I pay a lot of attention to it, but it's not the ultimate thing.
Can I ask a follow-up here about your own experience in a congregation? So like from realizing there was something worth exploring at a book length to then doing all this work while you're writing sermons and meeting, all the things happen at a congregation level in a red state on an election year. Like, how has wrestling with this history changed the way you think about your function or role or responsibility as clergy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we've seen sorting even in the congregation. So, my congregation trends fairly progressive. And so in some sense, I don't have to worry about being good for all time zones because the folks who might lean more conservatively have already left to go somewhere else, right? So some of the other data we've seen in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of sorting at the church level too. And I think that's a problem. I used to tell people when I was in Missouri, my church was in the state capital. It's 40,000 people. It's a company town. Everybody there works for the government, lobbies the government, or is retired from the government. And so in my church on Sunday mornings, I had the executive director of one party and I had all the senior staff of a candidate for another party. And all week long, they were competing against each other. And on Sunday mornings, they were taking communion together. And it was a beautiful thing. I think those kind of stories are becoming less and less frequent. And I also realized, in some sense, we feel more polarized because we are more polarized. The stakes really are higher. Our candidates are shifting as the populace is shifting. There's no answer in that. It's a huge problem. I don't know what we do about it other than remind people what this community is all about. We are a Christian community, not a Republican community, a Democratic community, or even a socialist or a libertarian community.
Brian, do you think that there's a solid vision of what maybe a flourishing mainline role would look like in the public square? Not flourishing like growing or whatever, but when you think of the public square and what mainline Protestant is struggling to get over after culture dominance, its reactionary response to kind of the growth of evangelicalism and such, what would its role in the public square look like if it had internalized the opportunity it has in the present?
Yeah. And I'm glad that you qualify that flourishing doesn't necessarily mean growing, right? Because I think that's too often how we have defined importance in churches, and that's not what the biblical story tells us. The biblical story doesn't tell us that the big group is the group that's following God all the time. And that's, I mentioned the Barmen Declaration because they were meeting 90 years ago right now to write that. The Confessing Church was a small minority of German Protestants that actually stood up against the Nazification of the church, right? And so I think that does help us to think about, let's stop worrying about, this is easy for me to say. I'm not a pastor right now. I have been in the past, but I am running a Christian ministry. So, religion and journalism are both dying fields. So I guess I'm doubly in the middle of this. Just like I get the temptation that a pastor like Beau has, and that you need to feed your family, right? And yet there's also this call that has been placed upon our lives. And there's something more important than, church growth. And so particularly when we start to think about what does it mean to go into the public square? Honestly, that's why mainline Protestants era is somewhat over, right? Is because they went into the public square and they marched with King and argued for civil rights. And that was a big part of why we saw leaving from mainline Protestants to white evangelical churches, right? I mentioned earlier that racism is so much wrapped up in Christian nationalism. But you know what? Fine, great. Mainline Protestants did what they should have done, right? So maybe you emptied the pews. You stood up in the public square and you said the right thing. You said that this is what God wants. All people are created in the image of God. And so that's what I think a vibrant public square witness from mainline Protestants looks like, is a world where we are pushing for more justice and more peace, and that may not be popular, and that's fine, because the right is not normally popular, and especially when we're in the world's empire, right? If you start talking about the turn the other cheek and love your enemy, that's not going to be popular to the empire, and so be it. So that's why, our urge to mainline Protestants is stop trying to be the church of the presidents. Let's be the church of the prophets. And you can't be both.
So I'll quibble just a little bit with what Brian said in the following way. Brian and I have been engaging a lot with David Hollinger's argument in Christianity's American Faith that the mainline church got smaller, not because it lacked meaning and the evangelicals offered meaning, but because it made more demands on its people and they left for an evangelical church that didn't force them to change. And I think that's right. I buy what Brian's saying. I buy what Hollinger's saying. However, one thing that did get said is that the mainline elites didn't bring their people along, right? So where there was a lot of decisions made at the elite level and it was never gotten down into the pews. So it also is the hard work of forming Christians and building communities so that justice work isn't just done by the elites in DC, but it's done in local communities of justice that are pushing their city councils, are working in their neighborhoods, are engaging the private sector. It's doing all the stuff at all the levels. And the mainline Protestants have to get away from the elitism that has too often been detrimental to their development as communities of faith.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we got a few questions, maybe short ones here from those watching. What is the problem with a nation based on the teachings of Christ? Isn't this Christian nationalism? And I think that kind of question, for those that might just be, beginning to notice how it's playing out in public, is there, and their understandings of Christ's teachings are something we're running at a deficit of in the public square.
Yeah, and I think the question does come here there's a difference between living out your faith in the public square and trying to codify it. And so, there's a difference for instance, I'll give you a very clear example. So I've gone and testified in the Missouri legislature on issues related to capital punishment. And every time there's an execution, I join a vigil outside the governor's office, holding signs, calling on the governor to stop killing people, to try to say that killing people is wrong. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Now, my faith leads me to go into those moments to stand up against capital punishment. But when I speak before the lawmakers on the death penalty, I don't cite my faith. And I tell them clearly who I am, but I don't tell them that they should vote against the death penalty because they're Christian, or because I want them to be a Christian and therefore they should vote against the death penalty. Right? I have different arguments that I make. And so I hope that understands. That's the difference to me. I'm driven by my faith. I'm driven by my values to make this world better, but I don't expect other people to adopt my faith in order to get there. And so I have to come up with a way of how do I convince them why this is also something they should support, whether they share the same faith tradition as me or not.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to remember, part of what is required for faith is an absence of coercion, right? So when there are certain things where the force of the state is used because as a collective we recognize certain rights, or the need to redistribute wealth to care for the least of these, or protect a species, or these kinds of things. But but faith, if it's in any way kind of expressed right in the person responding and giving allegiance to the way of Jesus, is not something that's coerced, and you can just see that because of how many people that checked none had parents that tried, and so that kind of coercion is different than an invitation and a public embodiment of values that are compelling, and a community that through the shared practices of them, it becomes internalized. And so there's always that tension of at what point the state's power is used. And if it's for faith, I'm going to guess there are quite a few baptisms of the indigenous people when the doctrine of discovery sent them over here that didn't really line up with an existential response to the invitation of the God of love revealed in the face of Christ. There's nothing quite like your own finitude to animate a performance. But I know Beau was excited when he saw this question, and it comes from the end of the lecture, which if those of you that are on here that haven't watched the lectures, you should go check them out. They're on the same YouTube channel this is on. But at the end of the last lecture, y'all talk about the practice of repentance. How do you envision repentance as a practice in the mainline churches?
Yeah, so I think this is really important because, again, Christian nationalism can seem like such an overwhelming problem. How can we do anything about it? And part of what we then do is get on social media and we scream at them. We scream at the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, the Trumpian Christians. And man, is that cathartic. It makes us feel good, but it doesn't actually do any good. It doesn't change anything. I will shock people when I tell them that rants on Facebook don't usually do much. So instead, what we got to do is look at where we have spheres of influence. My congregation will hear me out when I preach a word from the pulpit. They will listen to me. If I suggest we do something, they're going to consider it far more than the big mega church down the street. It's time that we interrogate our own practices. It's time that we interrogate our own traditions. And instead of just pointing the finger at them, we need to point the finger back at us. So we're big fans of each congregation kind of looking at its own practices of Christian nationalism. Educate your congregation, teach them what it is, and then say, let's look at what we're doing that perpetuates the problem. And then let's do the same thing with our denominations, whether it's kind of our local adjudicatories or even at the whole denominational level. We've pointed out that lots of mainline denominations, the Disciples, the ELCA, the Methodists, they've all made statements about Christian nationalism, but rarely are these statements about what they're going to do to interrogate themselves and change their practices. It's always about that problem out there. So we do need denominations to speak out. We do need a public witness, but we also need part of that public witness to engage in that practice of confession and repentance. We were a part of the problem in these ways, and we are going to change and do it differently going forward. So I think the work has to start with us. And I think if we do that work, not only will we lessen the amount of Christian nationalism that's just out there in our society, but we'll also create really compelling and attractive Christian communities that are more about the gospel than about propping up an empire or a retrograde social order. And that should be attractive to people because Jesus is a pretty compelling guy. We just got to make sure he can get heard through all of this clutter of Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm. I agree to answer this question by noting two churches that I happened to walk by recently or visit recently. So in April, I was in D.C. for the Summit for Religious Freedom by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I was walking nearby and went by New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. That's the church I talked about earlier where the pastor preached the sermon that got under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And on the outside, there's a big plaque honoring this, right? And we talk about this in the book of a couple other churches that are progressive mainline churches that are still celebrating their role in creating Christian nationalism in our country. So what would it look like if we started looking at our own history and instead of bragging about it, repenting of it? This is ways that we actually helped limit the kingdom of God by merging it with one nation. And then last week I was in Trier, Germany, the oldest city in Germany, which has, amazing Roman ruins and so forth because Constantine was building a bunch of stuff there. And he was building a throne room there. And it's the largest single big room from the Roman era that doesn't involve columns. And today it's a Lutheran church, which is in itself a fascinating theology, right? Of like the altar with Jesus on the cross is what was supposed to be where Constantine would sit on his throne room. And so that's quite a moment. But one of the things I did expect to see there was in their history of the building and their church, they have a moment there in the church has created this, where they acknowledge their failures during the Nazi era, that they didn't join the confessing church movement. And in fact, there were some people in the community that wanted to, and they barred them from attending the church. So they had to go start their own church. I wouldn't have known that part of their history. And I only know because they were willing to do the difficult work of honestly wrestling with their own history and then telling it. That's what we hope that mainline Protestants and other Christians will do. Look at your own church, your own denomination, look at those spaces first, and then let's start there because we probably aren't going to convince the Robert Jeffersons or the Mike Johnsons or the Sean Foyts or all of the others who are espousing Christian nationalism to change and repent. What can we do to reduce the merging of Christian and American identities in our own circles of influence and our own communities? Let's start there.
One last question, and I imagine this could turn into a whole nother conversation, but there are enough people that asked about it. And it's really around that connection between Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy. One of the questioners that sent it in, Paul, who's a hero of mine, he literally sold everything he had and moved to work with widows and orphans in Africa, and has since been an advocate for very different foreign policy from America. And a lot of it has to do with the way, right, like even our conversations around nationalism in America and the church and state relations still assume a lot of that the boundaries of our religious traditions match the boundaries of our nation state. And after a lot of things that were connected to our previous conversation about the trouble with our bipartisan system, towards the end of it, he said, what is the moral responsibility of Mainline Christian Church in its wedded commitment to U.S. empire, to Jesus in the least of these victims of the U.S. empire in the global South? How is voting perceived as absolutely necessary, yet no liberation of oppressed peoples abroad, especially ever comes up via a ballot limited to a two-party oligarchic system? You can see my frustration because I don't know what to do with my citizenship, but I would love to know what actions I could take to denationalize U.S. Christianity so the voice of Christ's body here can practice or develop roots of global kinship.
Yeah, so I'll say two things. In 50, I think I've got the year right, the constituting convention of the National Council of Churches, their theme was "This Nation Under God." Right? So when the National Council came together, that idea of Christian nationalism was present and articulated and in some sense baked into the DNA. So this really is a big problem for the church, that the tying of who we are with kind of being an American. I think one of the things the church can offer us is a more global awareness, right? So in theory, the church could help all of those Americans gathered for worship on Sunday in U.S. congregations to think more globally. One of the ways my church does it is we have a dedicated prayer time every week, and we always lift up a prayer partner. And it's not just, we're praying for so-and-so. It's our prayer partner this week is this country, and we have these mission partners working there that our denomination names for us, and we name it. We are connected to them. We have a participation in what they're doing, and they have a connection to us. And so if we can use our worship and our education moments to remind Christians that they are part of a global church, and we have to think beyond our borders. I think it changes how we as Americans think about issues like immigration, humanitarian relief, hunger. There's lots of issues that are of global consequence, certainly war and peace, that we could be thinking about differently if the church would do its job reminding us of where we first and primarily belong to.
You know, Tripp, because you read the book, I mean, we deal with this in a number of ways, not just the flag and the sanctuaries, the services closest to patriotic holidays like Memorial Day and 4th of July. There are so many ways where the church we have to start offering this witness that is different from nationalism, that we can give a different way of what it means to be Christian. And it's so important that we recognize that, especially in the United States, we've got to do this difficult work. Right? I mean, Christian nationalism, I think, can be a problem anywhere. But if you're a Christian in Moldova, I mean, if you're a Christian nationalist, I mean, it doesn't have the same feel as if you're a Christian nationalist in the United States, the global empire. Right? And so it is an even a harder job, and thus an even more important job for us to pull away from and recognize the wheat and the chaff and which is which, so that we can, do that difficult work here and beyond. I mean, so much of Christian nationalism is wrapped up with militarism. War fuels Christian nationalism. It inspires Christian nationalism when the flags come into the sanctuaries during times of war. And Christian nationalism fuels and inspires war. Right? And so this is so important for us to do that work of preaching that global gospel, a gospel that transcends borders. And it's going to sound political because it is. It might even sound partisan because we're so polarized, but it's not. It's a basic political teaching of what it means to be the church, that we serve a God who doesn't love America more than other countries. We're not that special, right? God has blessed the whole world. Jesus died for the whole world, right? I mean, that's what we've got to preach. And until we can detox from the militarism of Christian nationalism, we're going to continue to add to the problems and the genocide and all of the other harms of our empires doing around the globe. And it's such an important question.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and I had a whole game of Mainline Protestants' love of the West Wing, and I thought about using that. So we'll have to do that again later, because I think President Bartlett is like the fantasy of a mainline Protestant president. But this has been a ton of fun for all of you that are watching. It's been great. For those of you that want to keep hanging out and do more of this, you can join, and we'll be doing some more lectures and conversations. faithandpolitics.net. The link for the book is in the stream channel, but also when I post it and such, I'll add it on there. And so this has been a ton of fun. But before we wrap up, do you want to let people know the easiest way of finding and connecting with what y'all are up to?
Yeah, so our publisher would love you to know that the best place to order the book is chalicepress.com. And if you use the code BA podcast for Baptizing America podcast, I think you get a third off the cover price. So it's probably the cheapest place to buy the book as well. And then Brian and I write at a Substack called The Public Witness, which is publicwitness.wordandway.org.
And there, if you're at publicwitness.wordandway.org, hit the tab at the top that says Baptizing America. You'll find out more about the book and a bunch of links.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to do this again. Thank you for hanging out. And also, but you're more likely to come back on if you try to argue with me, because I can think of one person that argued with me that it didn't come back on, but I don't think that episode ever came out. It's just something about describing the eternal status of me that really made me think I didn't want to share it. But
that sounds like a story that needs to be told at some point along the way.
Well, there's a folder of all the unreleased episodes in a Dropbox of for if you've done it 16 years, there's a few doozies.
Well, I hope our sees the light of day. Oh wait, we're live, so
it's already live. See, I can't. Yeah, I think you're safe.
Well, thanks for having us. We really enjoyed this, and again, love the baseball cat.
All righty. Oh, it's the Greensboro Grasshoppers, by the way, your local minor league team. Which, if you have one, you should go. And you should check. A lot of them have midweek day games. If you have to do stuff on your phone and things, it's usually like $10. You can have a hot dog and watch a baseball game, and you're what's more American? And it's one of the places that I hang out with people that watch Morning Joe, because otherwise, if I find out they like Morning Joe, that's my prejudice. So like Morning Joe people, I'm like, it's triggering.